How should Canadian Christians approach the 2025 federal election? Today on the Bridgehead Briefing, we're going to be talking to a number of gentlemen who are experts in that field. We'll be talking to Doug Sharpe. Doug Sharpe hosts the National Leadership Briefing and serves as Executive Director at a National Citizen Action Organization. Believing that a healthy and functioning democracy requires the engagement of the citizens, Doug has dedicated much of the past 20 years to encouraging others to exercise their God-given influence in the arenas of education, media, politics, and civil government. We'll also be talking to Mike Schouten, who is the Executive Director of the Association for Reform Political Action, which has offices across the country and seeks to bring a biblical perspective to Parliament and to other levels of government. And then finally, we have Scott Hayward of the organization Right Now, which focuses on nominating pro-life candidates and informing voters about which pro-life candidates they should vote for. Here's our conversation. Well, thanks everyone for taking the time to have a discussion about the ongoing Canadian election. What I wanted to start off with is discussing the issue of assisted suicide or medical aid in dying. And so a lot of Canadians are unaware of the fact, because it's barely been covered, that a United Nations Committee on the Rights of Peoples with Disability have come out and condemned Canada's MAID regime in incredibly strong terms. So working my way around, Mike, can I get your reaction to that first as a rep of ARPA?
Yeah, sure. No, it was, I think, it was really providential that study came out just prior to the election. This is clearly something that, while it's not getting talked about, our next government is going to have to deal with this because of the sunset clause that's in our criminal code right now. That sunset clause, which says that as of March 2027, Canadians with mental illness as a sole underlying condition can avail themselves of euthanasia. So yeah, this is really, I think, speaks to what the international community is, their perspective towards Canada, like seeing Canada as a cautionary tale of what not to do when it comes to legalization of euthanasia. What we really appreciate about their findings is that they're recommending a rollback right to track one again. And they're also saying, like, don't go down the road of advanced care directives, mature minors, etc. So very strong condemnation of where we've been and an encouragement for the next government to roll this right back and protect vulnerable Canadians, especially those with disabilities again.
Scott, you guys work with pro-life candidates right across the country. How have they responded to this kind of news, and how do you think we should be talking about this during this period where very few people seem to be mentioning a really big story?
Yeah, well, it was great to see that study and recommendation come out. I think it's pretty reasonable. I've always maintained for the last number of years, especially when inflation was high in Canada a couple of years ago, and we were seeing all kinds of stories in the media about, veterans who can't afford, basic care or housing, or those who are impoverished. And then, of course, Mike mentioned, it being extended to those with mental health challenges. We're seeing story after story after story in the newspapers across the country about basically abuse of the assisted suicide regime, the medical assistance in dying, as it's so called, the MAID regime in Canada. And I maintained with a number of pro-life politicians that I think that not only do the vast majority of Canadians not support the extension of assisted suicide provisions to those suffering with mental health challenges and beyond, like advanced care directives and minors, which has been proposed by a few different justices coming from the Quebec court system. But I think that a lot of Canadians who supported the initial drive for assisted suicide back in 2016 in response to the 2014 Carter decision were kind of along the lines of, 94-year-old grandfather who's dying of terminal cancer, if we end his life 3 months earlier so he doesn't have to suffer the next 3 months, that's what I support. I think those people who wanted it for that and only that, now, probably not all of them, but probably a majority of them, I would say at least half, would say, you know what, the slippery slope is way too slippery for me, so let's roll it on back. So I think this report just kind of solidifies what we on this panel, and probably most people watching and listening to this, have thought all along. How that translates politically, it's not, unfortunately. And that's the really frustrating thing. We are now in the throes of a general federal election campaign. And I think this is a great opportunity, for example, the Conservative Party of Canada, or even for the People's Party, for that matter, to discuss this issue. And neither really seem to want to take it on, whether it be their leaders or their candidates. So if you're speaking with your PPC candidate, with your Conservative candidate, or even for your Liberal candidate for that matter, I even know that the NDP, when it comes to expanding the provision for assisted suicide to those with mental health challenges, they have actually even been not too bad on the issue. Speak with that about your candidate, because I think it needs to get out there more. And I think it could be an election issue. And I think whatever party wants to discuss it in a tight election in certain areas can really make a differentiation, especially between the two leading ones being the Liberals and the Conservatives.
Yeah, Doug,
Yeah,
what I wanted to ask you is, so why is an issue that is immediately relevant to millions and millions of Canadians not being discussed in this election? Everybody knows somebody who struggles with mental illness. If in 2027 the MAID regime is expanded to mental illness, this means that every family is at will become at risk of a tragedy that they are like unable to stop. The Conservatives actually did a good job on this with Ed Fast's bill. There was I attended a town hall in Oxford County, where I am, where 4 or 5 Conservative MPs were out discussing this to a full Legion hall. And their language was really well done. They seemed genuinely passionate about it, including my local MP, Arpan Khanna. He seemed really passionate about the issue, and so this is an issue that has wide applicability across the country. It fits directly into Pierre's messaging about how things are broken, because there's so many MAID stories that reveal that about the Canadian system. And he already supported the bill previously. Do you have any sense on why people are avoiding this issue like the plague?
Well, I think that I don't know that I can offer any sort of keen insights beyond what you guys already know about elections. Is it's a little bit different when you're talking about an issue like that in a town hall, where you have time to sort of unpack things. During an election cycle, of course, we've got the compressed timeline. We've got limited attention spans on any one individual issue. We've got limited desire of local media, or legacy media, to cover issues like this. And they do say that, I think we've all heard that expression, during an election, if you try to educate on an issue, you will lose. And so that's one thing. So it is a political timeline that we're in. However, one of the things that I've always believed and told our elected representatives that we get in touch with is that if you just simply break it down to one very simple thing, and that is, it's all about protecting the vulnerable that live among us in our communities. And it is the primary responsibility of civil government to pass laws and enact policies that provide for the safety and security of the citizens. They have no other primary responsibility other than that. So this is why I believe that it's not being spoken of, is because they're using the excuse of it. We're in a political timeline. However, I think they're a little lazy when it comes to just avoiding the conversation altogether, especially if you roll back the clock, like Mike had suggested, by the way, which I agree with, is a great idea. Going back to square one, you're going to find that right in the beginning, all of us remember when the federal government rolled out the legislation, and Quebec jumped on the bandwagon right away and immediately wrote their regulations. And Quebec got out in front of the federal government on rolling out euthanasia, claiming that they had the authority to walk it out on their own. If you'll remember, there was this obvious gap in protection between the legislation that was passed and the regulations that were rolled out in Quebec. As a matter of fact, we identified 27 weak points where there were gaps in protection. So again, there's lots of things you can talk about during an election, but perhaps we're just being a little lazy on the right side of the political spectrum and not wanting to take the risk on an issue like this.
So now looking at the left-hand side of the spectrum, because what's interesting about the MAID for mental illness, like they had to delay it twice, and they delayed it in response to like a really sustained pressure groups. All of you were part of that to some degree. Then there was disability rights groups that ordinarily wouldn't align with the pro-life movement on other issues were aligned on that. And there was kind of a collective outcry, even from suicide prevention organizations. And my sense of the sunset clause was like, well, we need to boil the frog a little bit more slowly. Like if we just keep on pressing the snooze button, eventually it'll kick in and we can pretend this debate is over already. Anybody can take this question. Do you guys have any sense of what a Mark Carney approach to MAID for mental illness would be? Because this is one of those issues that isn't necessarily ideologically predictable.
I think it's too early to see what a Mark Carney government intends to do with assisted suicide and with the sunset clause. One thing that kind of frustrates me about the Conservatives a little bit is that when you look at their party policy platform, is actually quite strong on assisted suicide. And a lot of our organizations have been involved for a number of years at successive conventions, making sure that the party policy reflects the will, A, of the party, and B, of the population writ large across the country, the electorate. And we saw the Conservatives, which is, a larger issue. On many issues in this election campaign, the Conservatives have won. The Liberals have got rid of the carbon tax, or at least put the rate to zero. The Liberals said that they're going to back away from the capital gains changes for the inclusion rates. And this is another one that the Conservatives have won on, because, like you mentioned, Jonathan, the Liberals have twice now hunted down the field the decision to expand assisted suicide to those with mental health challenges. And that's a really, really big issue in Quebec. There are even members, I've been told this by staffers and members of the Conservative caucus, there are members of the existing, we'll see if they win their seats, Quebec Conservative caucus that do support some of the provisions as proposed from some of the decisions by various justices from the Quebec court system, namely for advanced directives, as well as there are even members within the Conservative Party of Canada, I've been told at least, that do support the extension of assisted suicide to minors in one fashion or another. So if Mark Carney is polling as well as he is in Quebec, and that holds all the way to election day, and he wins, 40, 45, 50 seats in Quebec, you would probably imagine that his Quebec caucus wouldn't be all that different from the Bloc Québécois or the Conservative Quebec caucus on this issue. So that's going to be a very large part of a 180 or 200 seat Mark Carney Liberal majority government. It's going to be a very large portion, and you think that they would have an oversized voice in it. And then again, you do have the Liberals that were behind on nominations because they were polling so low, and they had to fill in a bunch of people. And let's make no mistake about it, as much control as Justin Trudeau had over the Liberal Party of Canada, because he saved it from 2011 to 2015, I think it's safe to say that at this point in time, Mark Carney has an equal, if not even stronger grip over the party, because he took it from 16% in the polls to, now pushing in some polls 40 or 50%. Numbers that haven't been seen for the Liberal Party of Canada since the election of 1968 with the first Pierre Trudeau, or the first Trudeau when he was elected. So I think we have to kind of wait and see. He hasn't said anything radical specifically on that issue yet. So I guess that's a positive sign. But at the same time, functionally, and perhaps Mike and Doug would disagree on this, maybe you too, Jonathan, functionally right now, in practicality, in practice, the Conservative caucus and leader have more or less the same position as the Liberals, which is, we don't really support the expansion of the provisions to those with mental health. The Conservatives take a little bit of a stronger stand. The Liberals have been taking a bit of a stronger stand because they're punting it down. But you don't hear from either party really condemning, the advanced directives, the expansion of it to minors, or even putting it back from track 2 to just track 1.
I think there's a couple things that we have to remember here. One is that when the Liberals put forward their latest bill to delay it, that was right on the heels of Ed Fast bill that's already been referenced. Yeah. And that bill had full party support from the Conservatives, but also from the NDP, and 8 Liberals also voted in favor of it. So the Liberals are not on the same page when it comes to our euthanasia regime in this country. They clearly are uncomfortable with all the expansions, and certainly to people with mental illness. But the reality is, if Carney gets in and this issue doesn't get talked about, they're going to take that as a commendation that, hey, whatever policy you had in place before, just like we support it, we support you guys. And my fear is that if he gets in and there's not an incredible amount of pushback, that sunset clause will just expire, and it's going to be available to people with mental illness. So we're going to have our work cut out for us if Carney does get in with majority and this issue doesn't get talked about.
So, Doug, I'll start with you with the next question. I've been getting a ton of questions from different people, and I wanted to kind of get all of your thoughts on this. There's so many different parties going on right now. And when you have a scenario in which Pierre Poilievre is pro-abortion and Mark Carney is pro-abortion, and notwithstanding the issue that we've just talked about, there's a lot of people who are saying, okay, I've got Conservative Party of Canada, I've got the Christian Heritage Party, I've got the People's Party of Canada, I've got all these different options. What should be guiding my voting decisions if I'm a pro-life Christian heading into this election? So how would you advise people who are asking that question? Because a lot of people are.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And you know what? I'm actually really thankful that there's these emerging parties. I wish they were stronger on the right side of the political spectrum, so that the conservatives would resist the temptation of racing towards the center of the political spectrum. I wish that they were concerned that there was somebody behind them that was going to mop up their support, which and that they would remain anchored on that further right side of the political spectrum. And I'm sure you guys all kind of agree there. And so, as a matter of fact, we just had Grant Abraham of the United Party of Canada. Now, granted, emerging party, very young, no threat to the Conservatives. But you know what? It's hard when it's difficult. Or pardon me, when a Christian conservative listens to Pierre or listens to what he doesn't say, and then runs into somebody like Grant Abraham, who's all about having the difficult conversations about euthanasia, abortion, are we a post-nation state? I mean, all these taboo conversations that seem to be avoided during this election cycle. So when it comes to voting, when it comes to actually a Christian in our nation casting a ballot, first of all, I will never tell somebody who to vote for. That's one of the things that's kind of different, and some people disagree with me on that. But I'll certainly provide them all of the information that they need to make an informed choice on election day, and I'll steer them to people like Scott and obviously you, Mike, at ARPA as well. And we love sharing your resources before that. But they will ultimately have to be the ones that stand before the Lord and come make an account for how they've conducted themselves on this earth. So cast that ballot wisely, and keep in mind that we have to have an internal perspective, not just a temporal, natural world short-term perspective.
Yeah.
I think that's really good, Doug. Yeah, it is. We don't encourage people to vote for specific candidates or parties, but certainly make them aware of where the parties stand. And on this particular issue, preborn human rights, it is, I think, for evangelical Christians, for pro-lifers, getting increasingly frustrating that the conservatives just view preborn children as a political liability and nothing more. And that it's hard even to say that, because I know a lot of good, solid pro-life members of parliament who run under the conservative banner. But they're just being censored and silenced when it comes to this issue. And I think the one party that's really trying to pull support and do, I think, what Doug has outlined here is what could be necessary in the Canadian political scene, a party on the right that holds the conservatives to the right a bit more and keeps them accountable. The PPC has put out a really good policy on abortion. In fact, it looks like they've lifted talking points straight off ARPA Canada's We Need a Law webpage. And we're encouraged by that. Like, we do think that not only should we find room and have a forum for this conversation as a nation with our lawmakers, we should also be looking around the world at what are other countries doing when it comes to protecting preborn children, and why are we not taking those steps as well. So we're encouraged by that there are some parties who are speaking about that. And I would only say that for the average voter, again, I'm with Doug, I wouldn't tell them who to vote for, but I think it's an important act as a citizen, and as Christians especially, we're accountable for everything that we do. And if we have to answer to God as to why there was a solid Bible-believing person who vowed to protect vulnerable Canadians and preborn humans, and we just dismissed that and went with the status quo or with whoever was in the lead, we're going to have to answer for that. I think we have to think seriously about who we do vote for on April 28th.
Yes, so I would track with that, because I voted for any number of different parties, because I was in a riding, for example, where the Conservative member of Parliament was very pro-choice. So at that point, I voted for, I forget if it was the CHP or the PPC candidate. I looked at which one I liked better in terms of their platform, and I voted for one of them, because I think one of the primary issues, I think even amongst Christians, is often we kind of confuse abortion as like it's an issue, but it's actually about a who. Like, we kind of think, oh, it's the abortion issue. Well, it's not, though. It's actually about real human beings created in the image of God who are being cruelly killed. And we can even kind of forget that. And so for me, I will never vote for anyone who endorses the killing of other human beings. That's just sort of what my line is. And so around that line. Yeah, around that line, it's kind of like, well, which candidate am I going to pick? So, Scott, especially looking at, the emerging PPC and stuff like that, you hear these questions all the time. So what's your general guidance?
Yeah, ever since our organization was created in 2016, we've had the policy of encouraging our supporters in every riding to vote for their most winnable pro-life candidate. And that's going to differ from riding to riding, because in Canada, we have to first pass the ballot system, first past the post ballot system. You can only vote for one candidate. And the candidate who wins the most amount of votes, even if it's only, 10% overall, that's the candidate that wins the seat. You can't vote for more than one candidate. So we want to make sure that your vote goes the longest distance. You have your highest return on investment. So in your riding, the PPC candidate might be the most winnable pro-life candidate. And the way we discover that is we reach out to all the candidates of all the political parties. We have a private and confidential interview where we ask them the same 7 questions. We don't reveal the answers, because we find that way we have, they're more willing to actually have that conversation with us. That's why, compared to other political pro-life organizations out there, we are able to identify more pro-lifers than they are. And that's reflected in the votes in the House of Commons over the last few different parliaments. But also, B, we also are able to have a more upfront and honest conversation, because there are some people who do take our survey and we find out, in fact, I just did 2 from the PPC earlier today. And I went through the survey with them and went through the questions, and they just didn't give answers that would be up to snuff for us, and I had to tell them, thanks for taking the time, but unfortunately we will not be supporting you as a pro-life candidate in your riding, and we will not be informing our supporters who live in that riding via email and text that this is the candidate that we recommend that you vote for, based on the 2 pro-life issues of abortion and assisted suicide. All the other issues that other people talk about, you have to refer to other organizations besides ours. So that's the approach that we always take. It's the most winnable pro-life candidate. And sometimes some people from smaller political parties that don't poll as high or get as many votes get upset at that. But, you're the ones out there to go and earn the votes. There were, last time in 2021 for the 44th general federal election, there actually were a few PPC candidates that were polling quite high, that were in strong seconds, where we did send door knockers and phone callers to, because they had somewhat of a shot, at least, of winning their riding. I don't see that this time around for this general federal election. So while we might recommend that someone vote for, let's say, a pro-life PPC candidate in their riding, because we don't know the position of the Conservative candidate or the Conservative candidate's pro-abortion, we won't necessarily recommend that people go and actually door knock for that PPC candidate who's pro-life that's polling at 2%, when they can hop in the car and drive a half hour to the next riding and help a pro-life Conservative candidate who's voted pro-life in the House of Commons when it comes to abortion and assisted suicide, and is a dogfight at a 35% split with their NDP, or probably more likely in this case, a Liberal opponent in this election. So we try to be very intelligent in our recommendations, and unlike the other 2 gentlemen on this panel, our organization will make a specific recommendation. That's the place that we fill. Mike and Doug fill other places in the movement. We fill that place, and we all work very closely together on that, to make sure that if you do want to get involved in this election beyond more than just your vote, that you're doing it in the best way possible to get as many pro-lifers in the House of Commons. One last thing I will say is, in this election, it's the first election that we're reaching out to all the Liberal candidates who are not returning members of Parliament, or members of Parliament from previous parliaments that don't have any record on abortion and assisted suicide, either at the federal or provincial level, because we have not heard from Mark Carney whether or not he is maintaining the policy of Justin Trudeau of disallowing pro-lifers from being as nominated Liberal candidates, or disallowing pro-lifers from voting as such in the Liberal caucus. So my riding, for example, we have a new Conservative candidate. I still don't know where he stands on our issue. We sent him a survey a few days ago, haven't heard back. Our organization has hundreds of people in this riding that we will have to inform. I'm going to be reaching out to the Liberal candidate. And if the Liberal candidate comes back to me and says, yeah, you know what, I would vote against sex-selective abortion, or I would vote in favor of a late-term abortion ban, guess which way I'm voting in my riding, and guess which way our organization is going to recommend. So we're very nonpartisan in that regard. And frankly, in the House of Commons in Canada, we're unlike the United Kingdom to a certain extent, and most definitely unlike the United States. We don't have a 2-party system. At any point in time for the last 50 years, there could be 4, 5, 6, 7 different political parties represented in the House of Commons and in the Senate. So to put all our eggs in one political party basket is also not going to work if our goal, which it should be, is electing a pro-life majority in the House of Commons to pass legislation. Like Mike said, he found, I think it's, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was the entire NDP caucus under Jagmeet Singh that voted against the expansion of assisted suicide provisions to those with mental health challenges. And you found a handful of Liberals. Well, we have to do the same on the abortion issue as well.
So I got another question that very few Christians in Canada are kind of considering, and I'll start with you again on Doug on this one. Let me set it up for a minute. There's very few people who really discuss the fact that in the Budget 2025 report released last December, that recommendation 430 was to remove charitable status for the purpose of advancement of religion. And for years now, you've had these sort of like test cases that have been floated out by activists who basically want to make LGBT values a sort of a litmus test for whether or not your ministry, your place of worship, your church applies for or is eligible for tax exempt status or charitable status. So the Toronto Star covered this story back in 2018. Of someone who was in a same-sex partnership who couldn't be a member of the Calvary Baptist Church in Oshawa, and then an activist promptly launched a campaign to get their tax-exempt status stripped away from them. I could belabor the case with about half a dozen other examples of this happening in Canada recently, and these ideas have been floated by people like Dr. Christopher Wells, former of MacEwan University in Alberta, now of course a Trudeau-appointed senator. So it's been their goal for a very long time to basically take a number of progressive social policies and make that a litmus test for whether or not your organization, ministry, or church is eligible for charitable status or for tax exempt status. And there's a report that was released actually just in the last couple of months that very few people have seen, that was commissioned by the Canadian government, that examines homophobia and transphobia in places of worship. And page 4 of this report identifies the problem. And the problem is essentially any place of worship that is actively homophobic is opposed to same-sex marriage or the ordination of LGBT identifying people. And so basically anybody who's watching this who holds those views are identified as a problem in a government report that came out quite soon after they recommended in their 2025 budget report to remove charitable status on the grounds of furthering religion. So in the context of this election, there's sort of this building crisis that activists have been working to for a long time. They're talking about churches in their government reports, the churches that many of us on this call attend. What do you think Christians should know, and how should we be responding to this kind of information from your perspective?
Wow, that's a big question, because there's a real, you're right, there's an awakening right now on both sides. There's, of course, and on the civil government side, they're really starting to see, wait a second, this isn't just a stick that we've been holding over the head of the church for a long time, which has kept them muted and subdued and quiet and in line, walking in order and standing down when we want them to. This is actually this is a weapon that we can use against them. We can actually start carving it up. On the church side of things, I think the light bulbs are going off over the heads of church leaders across the nation, especially with these calls that we put together with Fétine, Stock, and the church leaders, because that was discussed over 2 calls that specifically I can just remember looking out into the Zoom forum and seeing when Stock basically went over the details of what does it mean to lose your charitable status as a church. I think a lot of pastors for a long time had just thought that, well, it's just that we won't be able to give out tax receipts for, donations, and, we've got a great church family and they've got a giving heart, and, they kind of have danced around that. But when Stock said, no, wait a second, you lose your charitable status and you have 1 year to actually dispose of your assets to another charitable organization that is but not the same as you. And then all of a sudden they're going, well, wait a second. You mean my church building? You mean you mean my bank accounts? You mean, yeah, you've got a year, the clock's ticking. So the church is kind of waking up to, wait a second, this is a threat. I'm kind of sad to see that it's become such an entrenched part of the church. It's not so much his church as we all know. When you've got the civil government charitable status, it's more like civil government's church in Canada. So I mean, this is a big issue, but I am glad it's getting dragged out of the shadows into the light of day, and everybody can start seeing it for what it is. It's actually a threat that we've got to deal with, and it might not end well for us in the short term, but I'm confident that getting out from under the thumb of civil government in the long term, and I'm talking again eternal, is good for the church in Canada.
Mike, how's ARPA approaching this kind of subject?
Yeah, we've dabbled into it a bit, met with a few other stakeholders insofar as like what is a response to this. I think that a couple of things come to mind. One is that we encourage churches to, as Doug said, take this seriously, but also not see it in a vacuum in a sense of like we have seen this coming. I don't know about you guys in various parts of the country, but here in BC, it's becoming increasingly challenging for people to actually find land to even build churches. Cities won't give permits for that kind of thing because they recognize that, oh, if we do, then that piece of land is not going to generate any revenue for the city insofar as the property taxes and so on. So it's already been coming, and now it just seems to be more like right in our laps. I think what's very alarming about the recommendations that have come from that House committee making those recommendations to the finance minister is that it actually got this far, that they actually just copied and pasted recommendations from the BC Humanist Society and put them straight into their report. I think that gives us an indication of where culture's at. And I agree with Doug in the sense of it needs to be a wake-up call, not so much as like, let's fight back and make sure this never happens, which I think should be part of our response, but almost like we need to be prepared that we don't have this anymore. And that's going to be part, I think, of the persecution that's going to come as Canada just becomes more and more progressive. That's just a reality, I think, that we need to face. And I haven't given as much thought as Doug has as far as like if that's actually going to be a really good thing for the church. I think that when I think of things like Cardis, for example, a few years back did this Halo project where they really dug into like what is the economic benefit of giving churches charitable status and not ensuring that they have to pay property taxes. And it's incredible the economic benefit that a church, a community of believers can have on that community. I think that there's going to be a loss if churches don't have that charitable status for sure, to all of the intangible benefits in the surrounding area. But I think we have to be prepared that this is coming, and it's just part of the continued really like forced indoctrination by anybody. And you referenced that report, Jonathan, at the outset of this part of the conversation. Like when you read through that report, and I read through it, it's very clear that it's not just about you can't oppose same-sex marriage. It is very much about if you don't celebrate this with us, then we're going to get you. Like we are coming after you.
The language was, nice little church there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it, right? Like they, in their list of demands, what does it take to be an affirming church? One of them is to actually announce your affirmation by creating, queer positive spaces. And so, the mask is off. And so I'm grateful for that. At least, Scott, what's your thoughts about this?
Well, like our organization is only focused on the issues of abortion and assisted suicide. So for us, this is an issue very much on the periphery, but it is somewhat related because it does apply to pro-life organizations as well who do have charitable status, of which we are not, obviously, because we're 100% political. And organizations that have charitable status with the Canada Revenue Agency are restricted to having their activities only be 20% political, and at that, very, very restricted in what those activities could be. That being said, from a political perspective, from my own personal perspective, I think this is a great opportunity for a political party that is obviously not the Liberal Party. Actually, I would include the Liberals on this because it's under a previous Liberal premiership. So a premiership is the government of a prime minister. So this was under the Trudeau premiership. We're now under the Carney premiership, and they have every right, as did Justin Trudeau when he was there, but he's not anymore. So Carney could just ignore it. Carney could just walk away from it entirely. So the Liberals do have an opportunity here as well, which should but concern the Conservatives as well. I haven't heard anything from any Conservative member of Parliament, candidate, or the leader himself talk about this issue for months. And that's not just during this election campaign, but that's basically the entirety of 2025. I could be wrong, and if I am, someone please let me know. But as far as I know,
just to correct it, so I know for sure, Garnet Janis, MP Garnet Janis put out a petition on this and had a press release. He was all over it.
You know what?
Came out,
so did Jamil Javani as well. To be fair, Jamil Javani did it as well. Now that I think of it, but this should be part of the overall Conservative campaign. frankly, she'll also be part of the overall People's Party of Canada campaign, and they're focused on really weird issues right now, I would say. Jonathon, when you and I went to that one meeting back in 2018 when they had the abortion attestation, it was incredible to see the plethora of people at that meeting in North York or wherever we were in the GTA. And they had, Muslim imams and Sikh Gurdwara leaders and Hindu temple leaders and Buddhists and obviously Catholics and Protestants and all kinds of different people from all kinds of religions that are very representative, I would say overrepresented, in fact, in places like the GTA, in places like Metro Vancouver, in places like the South Shore of Montreal. And politically, again, bring this back to a politics perspective, these are swing ridings. Those are swing ridings for NDP Liberals and Conservatives in Mike's neck of the woods in Metro Vancouver, and more so Conservative, Liberal federally at least, into the Lower Mainland. There are big swing ridings between Liberals and Conservatives out throughout the GTA, and there are big swing ridings between the Bloc and the Liberals, and to a certain extent, the Conservatives can play a role sometimes here and there in the Eastern Townships and the South Shore of Montreal in that area as well. But no one's talking about it. However, I have a feeling that if it becomes less of a report and now a regulation and a policy, that's when it will really blow up. So it will be a political opportunity for when that happens. I don't think it will just be something that quietly happens in Canada, because it doesn't just affect white Christians. It affects Christians from non-white countries that live in those swing ridings that probably don't really know that this is happening at this point. And when it does happen, like the abortion attestation, they're going to get angry, and they're going to get angry fast.
That's a really interesting point you bring up, because I remember being at that meeting that you're referring to about the abortion attestation, and it was suddenly this glimpse of a reality that we in the pro-life movement struggle against, which is there's more people that more Canadians are closer to our view on abortion than they were to Justin Trudeau's, for example, abortion throughout all 9 months for any reason or no reason at all. A lot of them weren't even interested in joining the pro-life movement or doing anything pro-life or even voting on it as their ballot issue like I would. But if you tell them they have to affirm it, that's where they draw the line. And so you had a lot of religious leaders from non-Christian communities were like, but we're not going to get involved in this issue, but we're not going to sign off on it. You have to kind of back off. And that meeting kind of gave me a glimpse of what I think is a reality in Canada, which is that a key reason that churches haven't been stripped of their charitable status yet is because the government hasn't figured out a way to do it without also having the same standard apply to Hindus, temples and mosques and all these kinds of things. And they really don't want to do that. They want it to happen to the Catholic Church and to conservative Protestant churches, but they don't want to do it to these other places. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which is for everybody. I'd love to hear from everybody on this question. One of the things we really saw during COVID was what it looked like to live in a post-Christian country, which is to say that the majority of the ruling class, as it were, fundamentally does not understand what Christianity even teaches, what it's all about, the things that we believe, why we believe the things that we believe, right? You had politicians who essentially thought there was very little difference between a Sunday morning church service and going to the bar or watching a game or going to the theater. They lumped those all in the same category. And I think some of the things that we probably perceived as bigoted at the time were actually just a result of this massive amount of ignorance. It's been a couple of generations since a majority of Canadians went to church. According to Evangelical Fellowship of Canada's polling data from a couple of years back, only 11% of Canadians attend any form of worship regularly. And that's not just churches. That includes temples, gurdwaras, mosques, synagogues, which means 89% don't attend anywhere, even monthly. And that means that we're in this strange space where we're all talking about an election. All of us work with groups that want to actually bring a pro-life perspective to the public square in various ways. At the same time, we live in a country where increasingly we're almost having to serve as cultural translators for Canada's Christian communities and pro-life communities to a culture that doesn't actually understand a whole lot about what it is that we believe. And that was so clear in the report that we referenced earlier, and that you mentioned as well, Mike, where the majority of Canadians actually had a view of Christian churches, for example, that they were anti-LGBT. Why? Because when the CBC is going, if the CBC publishes a story about Redeemer University or Trinity Western University, it's not going to be about the fact that they adopted a road and cleaned up all the garbage, right? It's going to be the breaking news that they hold the same views Christians have held on these issues for 2,000 years. So the only time Christian institutions really get intensive media coverage is when there's some story in which they've kind of clashed with one aspect of the sexual revolution or another. So, how do Christians in general, in the political sphere, and pro-lifers in particular, frame our issues in ways that Canadians who increasingly don't share our worldview understand us? How do we kind of translate ourselves to a post-Christian culture?
Well, that's just such a fantastic question. I'm going to jump on that right away. You get me excited with all these great questions. Yeah, in our organization, I can speak to something that sort of keeps me up at night. You know, it's kind of the exciting thought exercises that I do from 1 a.m. till 3 a.m. You know, is how can we make this understandable and appreciated by the people we serve, and we serve the church, especially when it comes to politics and government. So we try to really speak their language in the church, but at the same time, we've got to teach the church that there's a whole other language being used out there in the political and governmental realm and in culture. And we try to do that, like you say, we kind of cross over. We're actually the cross-cultural bridge between them. And one of the things that I just really believe that we all need to do is accept responsibility at a real base level in the church, that if we aren't biblically literate or and able to articulate the most basic fundamentals of a Christian worldview, then we need to go to school. We need to get our game on, because if these things out there are going to be decided by civil government, for example, you take a look at any of these issues we're talking about today, all of these, and again, you don't like calling them issues, I don't either, but all of these things that we're talking about fundamentally impact in either a negative or positive way our neighbor. And we as Christians are called to love our neighbor. So therefore, we should be interested at the very least in having conversations at election time with who's going to be the government to decide about the care of our neighbor. So, I mean, it's just sort of that kind of a thought exercise that we go through. But at the end of the day, each of us on our own as individuals and in churches, if a pastor is serving their church, we're always encouraging them to really make sure that people are fundamentally able to articulate their Christian worldview on things that they believe in at election time. You know, I mean, for example, like we're in an election right now, be able to have a conversation with your candidates and say, it's not so much about us standing up there and watching our candidates sort of prattle on about the things that they think are important to us. We've got to be able to get into a conversation and articulate the things that are important to us from our perspective, like, again, abortion and euthanasia and all of these issues, and do it from that posture of, you know what, I love my neighbor, I care about my neighbor, and I need to know that they're going to be protected, as an example.
Yeah, I think it's
I was just going to say, if Doug is up from 1 to 3 in the morning thinking about these questions, he should also be starting to smoke a brisket as well. Might as well kill 2 birds with 1 stone there, Doug.
A fellow smoker. That's a fellow smoker.
Mike, you're about to say?
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating question. I think that we always talk about how as we bring God's truth into the public square, we need to do so with grace. So grace and truth together. If it's too much truth, it comes across as a hammer, it's bombastic, etc. But I think what's happened in the past decade and a half is that there almost becomes too much emphasis on grace. And as Canadians, we want to be nice, we want to be liked by everybody, and that impacts the church, and in particular, it impacts church leaders. And that's why you do see a lot of evangelical churches who, rather than focusing on the injustice of euthanasia and abortion and how we're treating kids with gender dysphoria, they're talking about climate justice and gender justice and Indigenous rights. Those are the 3 issues that they like to care about. And I think that while there's obviously discussion to be had there, the reality is they're doing so because they want to be liked by everybody. They want to fit in with society. So we got to find a way actually to bring truth, still with grace, but bring truth as it relates to the magnitude of some of these injustices. And when in 2023, 15,000 people are turning to euthanasia as a response to their suffering, whether it be from homelessness or can't afford medication or mental illness, etc., that's a tragedy. When the recent high stats show that we have an 8-year high in reported number of abortions in our country, over 100,000, that's a tragedy. So we need church leaders to actually start to take those seriously and encourage the people under their care as the over shepherds of their congregations. That's what they need to be sending the message on. Like, this is what we need to care about. And then, as Doug said, an election time is prime time to bring those issues up, because that's when our neighbors, our coworkers are paying attention to these very things. So I think it's very important that as church, that's what we need to do. We always say in ARPA, as things seem to be getting darker, as God's light, we should be shining brighter. Like, you notice lights more when it gets dark, and often that's what attracts people. So we need to find ways to do that, to, I think, harness the energy, and you earlier related to COVID, harness the energy that was created through COVID, where whether you were indifferent to politics or not, you couldn't avoid it, because politics came right into your bedroom and into your living room. You had to have a perspective. Now we need to harness that energy into positive ways that really bring truth out. We're not embarrassed. We're not apologetic about the fact that our God is a God who wants us to protect our neighbor, including protecting their life if they think their life's not worth living because they have, whether it's a terminal illness or any other kind of disability. That's what needs to be our primary focus during this time.
Scott, amending the question slightly for you to look at what Right Now focuses on. You're talking to candidates all the time, and obviously these candidates want to win their election. So when you're talking to them, how do you advise they address issues like abortion and euthanasia?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's quite easy, and I think we need to talk on the ground where the vast majority, I would even say a super majority of Canadians are. So right now in Canada, on the issue of abortion, I'll start with that one. We're one of 2 countries in the world, the only democracy in the world, where there are no restrictions whatsoever on abortion, all the way up until the birthing process at 9 months. The only other country in the world where that's the case is North Korea. Even China has stipulations regarding sex-selective abortion, as does now Vietnam. So the rest of the world is moving on with us and has for a number of decades. When you look at the 1988 Morgentaler decision, it was actually a very good jurisprudence. It said that the law at the time was not being applied evenly, so Parliament needs to come up with some sort of law on abortion. It could be right at conception, could be abortions for all, for any time, all the way up to birth, or somewhere in between. But whatever it is, like, you have to make a law. And so that's the hope. That's where everybody's organization comes from. We need a law, right? Because we need a law. So what would that law look like, and what can we start with? Well, when you look at the issue of sex-selective abortion, which, like, to be frank, isn't a ton of the 100,000 abortions that Mike is talking about per annum in Canada, but we are talking about several hundred, and some estimates up to a few thousand, and they are concentrated in specific geographic areas of the country, but those are lives, right? And that's better than nothing. You have 84% plus of Canadians that support legislation that would restrict sex-selective abortion. We did a poll back in 2020 where it showed that even 64% of those who voted for the Bloc Québécois in the 2019 general federal election would be more likely to support a political party that would propose banning sex-selective abortion. You have a number of polls saying that Canadians, again, the supermajority, 70% plus, would support banning late-term abortion. So these are nice, easy issues to discuss. There are pieces of legislation and statute around the world, even south in the United States, where they have legislated on this, where since they've legislated on it, seen a decrease in the abortion rates. People don't go on to lose their seats after the following election. And there's a way to talk about it. And Mike kind of mentioned it a little bit. In the Catholic world, we would call it speaking with both clarity and charity. So be very clear and direct about what you're talking about and what you want, but at the same time, you don't have to sound like a Nick Fuentes, for example, on the issue. You can sound like a normal human being, like we're all discussing right now, and talk about the issue that way. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but when it comes to assisted suicide, I believe, I do, and there's no data on this. I would love to see a polling firm like maybe like Abacus, because I think David Clodo does great work, or maybe an Angus Reid, go out there and ask Canadians, in lieu of basically everything that's happened and the abuses, let's call them for what they are, of assisted suicide in this country over the last number of years, where do you now stand on the issue? Do you want it to be super restrictive? Comparatively, like when the first legislation came out in 2016, do you want to be more restrictive than that? Do you want it to be just gone completely? Where are you? And I think probably most Canadians, including in swing seat areas politically, like in the Metro Van area, Lower Mainland of BC, and the GTA, probably be more on the side of restricting, if not banning. So I think it'd be good to get some data on that. But even if you don't have the data on that, I think that's the way candidates should speak about this issue. Now, depending where the candidates are, I think sometimes it's good to make it part of your campaign, whether you're running for a party nomination or you're running in a general federal election or a by-election. In other areas, maybe not as much. Maybe you have to coax it in specific language, but I think it does need to be talked about. You're going to have to vote on the issue. We're in the House of Commons. You're going to be come after for your votes by the media, by Abortion Rights Coalition Canada, and you're going to have to answer for it. And it's not that hard to answer for. So and we do media training. Jonathon, I know that you've been a part of that. There's been people in your organization that's been part of that. My colleague Alyssa does that all the time with candidates. Mike and Doug, I'm sure you've done the same in the past. So it's really not that difficult, especially when you have a super majority of Canadians on side on those issues, because those are great places to start.
So you've all been very generous with your time. So I have one final question that I would like to hear from everybody on, because there's a lot of people right now, after 9 years of Justin Trudeau, who was the most extreme Canadian prime minister we had on virtually every issue that we care about. So Canada went from, euthanasia being illegal to a cautionary tale almost overnight. Like in the UK, MPs who are supporting the legalization of assisted suicide are like recoiling with horror when they're accused of being Canada. Like that's clearly way too far, right? This all happened under the tenure of one prime minister, from Bill C-14 to the present. Same thing when it came to like abortion turned into this issue. You would say it can't get worse. But under Justin Trudeau, it turns out it could get worse. We could send billions of dollars to developing countries and to fund abortion there. We could push it overseas. We could kind of forbid left-leaning pro-lifers for running for the Liberal Party of Canada, and on it went. And so heading into this election, a lot of Canadian Christians after these past 10 years are like, we need to get them out. We need to re-elect a different government. And let's say a conservative party under Pierre Poilievre was to get elected. When I look at the changes that have taken place over the past 10 years, I went back the other day and looked at the column that I wrote predicting how bad things would be after Justin Trudeau's victory in 2015. And my goodness, was it optimistic. But if you look at how much damage has been done, even if we had, say, a conservative government that was very open to a lot of the kind of socially conservative policies that we care about, when I look at the fact that Justin Trudeau has appointed nearly all of the senators, and the people he's appointed to the Canadian Senate are people like Dr. Christopher Wells, an LGBT activist, Charles Adler, he's sort of like a knockoff Michael Corrin. These are the kinds of people that have been put like a cork in the legislative process, so that even if Pierre Poilievre said we're going to repeal C-14 and we're going to take this all the way back, we're going to go back to the drawing board with euthanasia, even if he said, we need to fix the definition in the conversion therapy law to ensure that it's not too sweeping. If we want to take up aspects of the abortion debate, maybe just by not funding it overseas for starters, how much could a government even get us back to where we were in September of 2015?
Well, I think there's a few different avenues you have to look at there, right? So you mentioned the Senate. Well, that's a consequence of Stephen Harper not appointing 18 senators because of the Senator Mike Duffy scandal affair, whatever you want to call it.
The only scandal in which a government employee was targeted for paying the government back money.
Yeah, that was, oh my goodness, it was his chief of staff. His name is escaping me right now, but Yeah, exactly. Paid it reimbursed $90,000 to the Canadian taxpayers, and that was a huge scandal. But there are consequences for actions, and there are consequences for lack of action, right? And that was a consequence of a lack of action. What's one of the very last things that Justin Trudeau did before his premiership ended and the Mark Carney premiership took over? He appointed 5 senators, and good on him. And that's the type of attitude we need to have. I was gonna say as conservatives, but as social conservatives, regardless of whatever political party we happen to reside in at any particular point in time. One thing that our organization did leading up to the 2019 general federal election, the 43rd one, was we put together a list of pro-life lawyers from across the country. Mike, we worked with people in your organization at that time from that did excellent work. They're the ones that did the real work. I just try to herd the cats, so to speak. And the reason for this is because we went through all 1,178 federally appointed justices across the country. We did Library of Parliament questions. We did our own research to find out when these justices retired. Because unlike the United States, in Canada, a justice at the bench has to retire at the age of 75. At 65, they become a supernumerary, which is basically like, oh, they're just, like a part-time retired justice, and they just hop onto the bench whenever they need them. But 75, you're out no matter what. And so we looked at, okay, who is going to be leaving the bench sooner rather than later? And where are they? Are they a justice in Windsor? Are they a justice in, somewhere in Alberta? And those are the areas where we would try to find pro-life lawyers that we can recommend to a future attorney general to appoint. Because another thing that Harper did was made terrible appointments to the bench, including the Supreme Court of Canada. So the Carter decision, which was a 9-0 decision, that overturned Stare Decisis decision from the 1993 Sue Rodriguez case that basically foisted assisted suicide upon Canada, which is insane that A, it's 9-0 because the Morgentaler decision was 5-2, and B, that one decision was written in the Morgentaler decision of the 5 justices that voted to get rid of the abortion law at the time. There were 4 different opinions written on it. Is crazy because 6 of those 9 justices were appointed by Stephen Harper, right? So that's a really good place to start on as your appointments. Another thing is legislation. So legislation, of course, is difficult to do when you have a Senate that's 84 of the 105 are appointed specifically by Justin Trudeau, and who knows how many Mark Carney will get to appoint after the next general federal election that at this point he's likely to win. You have to prosecute your case, right? So Pierre Poilievre has wanted to and generally done well on prosecuting the case on the carbon tax. Guess what? The carbon tax is gone, or at least the rate has now been set to 0. You won. Take that passion, take that issue, take that energy, take that money, and start talking about some other issues as well, and you can have the same effect. Another thing that you can do, and the final thing I will say is, as a government, when your cabinet has the backing of the House of Commons, there are many things that you can do that you don't need Parliament for. So you can have an order in council where you have the cabinet vote. So you can do amended regulations to different parts of the act, which are allowed in different statutes of the act. So, for example, the Income Tax Act. The Income Tax Act, not every single little thing that gets changed that the Canada Revenue Agency does has to go through Parliament, because that would take forever. So the Act says in there, as voted by Parliament, on a whole swath of things, we're leaving it up to Cabinet through an order in council vote, or sometimes even just a ministerial directive, just from the Minister of Finance, him or herself. And it's just to save time. It's a practical thing. This is something that happens in many advanced Western democracies. And if you don't like the order in councils and you don't like the ministerial directives, then campaign on them. So you could stop funding of abortion overseas with a stroke of a pen, probably from the Minister of Finance alone. I doubt you'd need an order in council for that. You could change a bunch of regulations to the various acts of Parliament that have been passed to regulate assisted suicide in this country. If you don't think you could get them passed by the Senate, or you try to and you don't, you could probably do it that way as well. And finally, if the courts get in your way and they rule, well, this is unconstitutional because the charter or something like that, then just use the Section 33 notwithstanding clause if it applies. And if it doesn't apply, then just pass a different piece of legislation, because guess what? It's going to take years and years and years and years for that legislation to make it back to the Supreme Court. And by then, you have practically applied the law as you have written, both in the regulations and the Act. And practicality matters, because if what's happening in practice or pardon me, what happens in practice that stems from the law affects the culture. So one thing that we always hear that my organization really despises is the law always follows culture. And that is true to a certain extent, but the law also influences culture. It goes both ways. It isn't one way or the other. So if a future conservative government that's open to social conservative issues, which I'm not saying that this current iteration of the Conservative Party with the current leader is, though I'm not saying it's totally against it either. There are a variety of things and ways you can do. You just have to be intelligent about it. You have to be prepared, which our movement is now. And you actually have to have the political will and apply the political pressure to do these things.
So this is great. Just quickly, I know because we're going to run out of time probably soon, but Jonathon, to your question, like almost 10 years of Trudeau and just where Canada's at compared to 2015, it's going to take a long time to unwind that, as Scott's indicating, to replace senators, to replace justices. So that's going to take work on that side. But I think the other factor that is hugely at play here, and Scott, you kind of touched on it, is this just the aspect of administrative law, essentially, where the bureaucracy has grown to somewhere between like 300 and 500,000 people, and they are a highly influential, and those are predominantly liberal, progressive type of people that are working in the bureaucracy. And I remember before 2015, like one of the last things that happened within the bureaucracy before Harper lost the election to Trudeau was that Health Canada and the bureaucrats there approved RU 486. So, and that was after 10 years of Harper being the prime minister, right? And unable to make those types of changes within the bureaucracy so that those types of decisions weren't made that way. They were made the other way, right? So I just want to speak to, I think we have to have very measured expectations, even if the polls turn and Pierre Poilievre gets a minority or majority government, very measured expectations as to how quickly things can turn around. Unless we, Canada, implement some kind of Doge ministry and just cleans that all up like within 6 months, it's going to take a long time to reverse some of the really bad policy developments that have happened under Trudeau's tenure.
Jonathan, sorry, can I quickly jump on that? Because I have a story that I would like to share. We haven't had many stories yet in this discussion, but I think it really highlights Mike's point. Sorry, Doug, and then I'll be quiet here. But I was told by a bureaucrat, yes, I am friends with some bureaucrats, that and at the time this bureaucrat was working in a different department, right? But was able to tell me this story because I had friends in this department. When the Harper government implemented its maternal health initiative back in 2009, 10, 11, so this is before they got a majority vote. And they said, which I thought was a great initiative, we're going to go and invest all this money into countries suffering, particularly in the sub-Sahara of Africa, and we're going to help them out, and we're going to help out mothers to deliver babies well, to have healthy pregnancies, to help them out for making sure that they're healthy enough that if they want to breastfeed their children, they're able to do so, and their children are going to grow strong and everything like that, and have a great start in life. One of the best initiatives coming out from the G8. And part of that was, we are not going to be funding abortifacients and abortion procedures as part of this initiative. This did not require a act of parliament. All this required was ministerial directives. I can't remember if it required an OIC or not, an order in council. But when they did implement this, a number of bureaucrats were so enraged in the Canadian International Development Agency that they quit. They quit their jobs. They left. They didn't just go to a different government department. They left government. So you can have an effect pretty quickly with something relatively small, and it builds, right? When Mike's talking about that administrative law, it builds, and you have as a cabinet a lot of control over it. They didn't fire these people. They just got so pissed off at what the Harper government was doing, or in this case not doing, that they just left on their own. Now, the other side of that coin is a lot of these people returned when Trudeau got back in, and they started to readjust the funding for the maternal health initiative toward funding tons of abortions and abortifacients in Africa. Because not only did they expand the amount of money they were spending overseas on this, but they also needed more people in the bureaucracy to ensure that this funding is actually happening. So they hired those people back. So it goes both ways. But one of the bad things about conservatives is that we tend to conserve. And sometimes you can't conserve what's already there. You actually have to go back from the cliff that you're about to drive the car off of and go into a completely different direction. And if we look at, and sorry, this will be the last thing, if we look at what's happening in the United States with the state government in Florida, with what Ron DeSantis is doing, he is doing an exorcism of sorts. And what I like what Ron DeSantis is doing as opposed to Doge is that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But the Ron DeSantis government is using the power of the state to actually push for good policy initiatives. And I think that's what we need to do in Canada, is not only just get rid of a ton of bureaucrats, which is part of the package, don't get me wrong, but we also need to be hiring specific people, and we need to use some parts of the bureaucracy of the Crown to be pushing for specific good policy initiatives.
Final word to you, Doug.
Yeah, thanks so much. Wow, such great information here today. Really, really excited to be on the call with you guys. As far as going back to 2015 goes, yeah, we can't go back. Definitely can't go back. But then when I think about going back, I go, you know what I think about back then? And I go, 2015, where Stephen Harper's government, after the many years he was in power, was I even all that happy about where he left things? And I really wasn't. So I don't want to go back. So moving forward, yeah, I say let's go enrage some bureaucrats. Let's go create circumstances where we can get some mass firings or quitting. Hey, if they quit, that's even better. And I don't know that, and because of course you guys pointed it out so accurately, I don't know that we have the same levers we used to have because of the entrenchment of the bureaucracy and things like the Senate. So we as an organization, we're actually going to shift our focus, a percentage of it, a good percentage of it, away from sort of the national macro perspective, and really start building and focusing on growing our local initiatives and community initiatives. Community engagement is going to be a big part, I think, on the road ahead. I think that we can do an awful lot at street level to actually build coalitions, put the pressure that needs to bear on the issues that affect local communities, and also if you're talking about building a stick to a political stick to hit people with, I mean, we definitely can do that at the local level as well when it comes to electoral district associations, regular meetings with members of parliament, teaching churches how to be more effective in communicating their concerns to local governments. And you know, I mean, I really see the door kind of slammed shut to a degree nationally. So let's take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves locally, and remember that you know what, we can do a lot when we work together, and especially when it only takes 200-300 people to win a nomination. It only takes maybe 100 people to take over an electoral district association board, and then all of a sudden we have a voice and a presence, and we're speaking directly into the system, perhaps from the bottom up instead of the top down.
Mm-hmm.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
Good to be with you.
Good. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you all for tuning into this special episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. For those of you who want to follow up on these gentlemen and check out their work, it's incredibly helpful as you discern how you're going to be voting in this upcoming election, if you are in fact still discerning that. So if you want to find Scott Hayward and their work, go to itstartsrightnow.ca. If you want to find more about the work of ARPA Canada and Mike Schouten, go to arpacanada.ca. And as for Doug Sharpe, go to cdncal.ca. You can find them all there. As always, share this around if you found it helpful. Please like the video if you found it helpful. Drop a comment to engage in the conversation, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast platform. Thanks so much.